All right, good morning, everybody. This is the Assembly Enterprise Utility and Oversight Committee of the Whole for July the 16th, 2020 at 11 a.m. I'm Christopher Constant, chairing the committee. Ask everyone to mute their system so we can avoid feedback and noise. Everyone mute. There's somebody pretty loud. Or Mandy, can you figure out who's unmuted? And then next, take the roll, please.
Okay. Mr. Constant?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy? Ms. Allard? Mr. Perez-Vivia?
Here.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Here.
Ms. Salatel?
Here.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton? Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Thank you, Chair.
Hey, Chris, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Chris.
Of course I am. Thank you. So we have a packed agenda and a tight timeline, so we're going to have brief reports. About a month ago, I was asked by Mr. Falsey to seek from the primary users of the port position papers. We've all been hearing in conversation with the users their perspective on the plan of finance. And so I'm going to give each group, both Tote and Mattson, just say 4 or 5 minutes each to discuss the document that they submitted. All the members should have received an email that included both the letters from Tote and Mattson. Mattson's document is quite substantial, and the thing to do now would be to start, and I'm gonna, because your document's big and I see you here, Val, I'm gonna ask you to go first. So 5 minutes if you could to kind of lay out the letter and its concept.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Yeah, so thank you for giving us this opportunity, and joining me from Mattson is Lee Fishman, who you can see, Jonathan Ogle. They're both in our corporate offices in Oakland, dealing with corporate development in the case of Jonathan, and Lee Fishman is one of our investor relations and financial persons with an extensive background in finance. And then, of course, Dylan Favor, who you know. So let me start, and I thought I'd summarize our letter. So it starts with, why is there a Port of Alaska modernization program? And the driver really is replace the piles that are nearing their end of life. That's the driver. So with that, we also need to reduce the ever-present seismic risk, which we all understand given where we live. And the other thing is, for Alaska, we need a port to handle the industry standard ships beyond the 2 current carriers in our specific requirements. The port needs to be able to handle industry ships, and the port needs to determine what infrastructure Alaska needs. This is not a Mattson project or a Tote project. This is a port project. So our view is that in lieu of the proposed specific terminal tariffs to fund the PAMP, our vision is pretty simple. We outline really a 3-step process. The first thing is we need to work with the stakeholders to optimize the design requirements to meet the needs of Alaskans. And we're working closely with the port to accomplish that, as I know Tote is. And then we need to leverage the political capital of the stakeholders to secure federal and state funding. And then our vision is we implement a single tariff on the cargo that crosses the dock to fund the balance of the monies that are needed. And as I'd mentioned, in terms of costs, we firmly believe, we're working closely with the port, and we firmly believe that those cost numbers are going to come down. So what do? Basically, we want to continue to operate, but for the piles needing replacement, we would be continuing to operate and be just fine. And we're running against the clock, as everyone knows. And I think the other thing we want to recognize is the port is a public asset. It's not private property. And so the tariff and funding for that should be reflected as such. So what are our choices? And I kind of looked through our letter and would put it this way. So we to me is the port, Matson, Tote, all of us are the stakeholders. We want it to be affordable, not unaffordable. We want it to have flexibility, not limited to a carrier or two carriers. We want it to hit industry standards. We want it to be economically sustainable, not economically disruptive. We want a level playing field, not an unlevel playing field. We want to retain cargo that we have. We don't want to lose cargo, and we run risk of losing cargo to others, right? The idea that one carrier would pay $506 more for a container for the same customer, for the same cargo crossing the docks, just doesn't seem right. And that will shift cargo, not just away from Matson, but I think it will shift cargo away from the port. And then the other way to look at it is from the lender perspective. We know we're going to be asking to get a lot of money to fund this. So we want to be attractive. We don't want to be unattractive. And the example we give, which I steal from Lee, 1 minute?
Val, you have 1 minute. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Is the toll road. So and the idea is we just want the cars crossing the road to pay for the road. And lastly, cost of funding, we want lower rates and lower costs, not higher rates. And we want to protect the port revenue. We don't want to disrupt the port revenue. So that's our reason. So I would add, we are absolutely committed to finding the optimal solution, and we're committed also to purchasing the gantry cranes to support our operation. So I think I made it, Chris. You're on mute.
You are well within your time with 20 seconds to spare. Now, Alex Huffling with Tote, I believe you are on the phone. I don't know if you're muted. Are you there? If you are on the phone, I think you hit *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi, you've got Alex Hofling with Tote.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. So similar to what we just had as a presentation from Matson, I'm hoping that you will kind of run us in brief through your comments on the plan of finance, and we can start now.
Certainly. Well done, Val, by the way. So I'm Alex Hofling. I'm the Vice President and General Manager for Tote. I'm located in Anchorage, Alaska. I would like to first thank the administration for releasing a comprehensive plan of finance, and also thank the Assembly for the work they do on behalf of the city, including addressing the port infrastructure. And certainly thank you for allowing me to share our position. The POA is a critical piece of the Alaska supply chain. As a reminder, the plan, the modernization plan calls for Tote's berth to be complete in about 10 years. Currently, we have 46% corrosion at our wharf, and further delays will jeopardize the facility. Our position is simple. Tote supports the plan of finance. The plan of finance lays the groundwork to complete designs. Costs should be assigned to those benefiting from port infrastructure, and we are not asking for other port users to fund our core requirements. We call it three primary reasons for supporting the plan of finance. Number one, it aligns the public good to the incentives of the cargo carriers. Under the cost causer cost pair model, there is no assumption somebody else is paying for core requirements, which will and has already driven down costs. Incenting lower supply chain costs for Alaska is good. The funding model forces the carriers to think about the designs and the costs as if they're our own capital, and including only operational necessities or operational efficiencies. Number two, the plan of finance follows precedent and is the right model for the future. Tote has already funded port development in the past. When we needed additional port infrastructure for a new class of vessels, we paid for it. We would expect consistency in funding using this model. If port users, including Tote, need port infrastructure in the future due to operational changes, the model should not B, to allocate costs to other users. And number 3, cargo berths are used almost exclusively by Tote and Matson. The cargo carriers do not share or benefit from one another's infrastructure. The fees we pay the port already vary due to our operating models. Further, our operating models already create vast differences in costs, including port fees, operating costs, stevedoring, fuel, and capital. Tote built the Orca vessels to service Alaska in 2003 as the largest investment in our company's history. The vessels are generally more expensive to build and operate than a container vessel. They were built with lower port infrastructure in mind to best serve our customers and the market. The port should not undo the economics of Tote's operating model. So in summary, Tote supports the plan of finance. This is the right plan for Alaskans, is consistent with previous port development funding, and considers the circumstances of the port users. The plan of finance lays the groundwork for us to complete designs. We maintain, as before, costs should be assigned to those benefiting from port infrastructure, and we are not asking for other port users to fund our requirements. Thank you for allowing me to share our position, and certainly happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
How do in time?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would note for the record that Mr. Weddleton has arrived to the meeting, and I would now open the floor to questions from the members. I don't see any in the chat. If you have any, now would be the time for this topic.
I have one, Mr. Constant. Sorry, I didn't write it in the chat. This is
And
Austin.
or you can text or write in the chat or just speak up. Thank you, Austin, please.
I'm just curious in hearing from Tote about what we've done in the past. It'd be interesting to hear Matson reply to that. I mean, it seems that you're basically advocating that we have other users subsidize your work. And so I'm just trying to understand if you can give me some examples of where that happens and why, really explain why you think that's appropriate here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
You good? So I think first thing, we pay $1.6 million a year for the maintenance of the cranes. So that's a differentiator. We have said we will pay for the cranes that we need. I think that the real premise is this is a public port, and the port needs to decide what it needs to support ocean transportation into Alaska, right? Carriers come and go. The port needs a port where a ship can come in and load and unload cargo. That could be a Matson ship today, could be a container ship in the future of somebody else's. And I think that's where there's a disconnect.
Okay, any follow-up?
Yeah, if I can, Mr. Constant.
Please.
So why wouldn't the goods that required a more expensive method be higher in price to accommodate that? I mean, to me, it seems that's how we generally pay for goods, is based on the cost of producing it and getting it here. That's the cost of the good. So I guess I just don't understand why that principle wouldn't apply here.
I think because it's a public asset, and the public asset, this is not for Matson, this is for the state of Alaska for the next 75 years. So I'll use the example in Hawaii, which did the same type of port modernization program. They decided what the port needed, which is for the state of Hawaii, based on all the inputs from the different users. Then they came up with a plan. They figured out how much that plan was going to cost. They built it. And then the cargo pays for that through wharfages for the cargo that crosses the dock. And that is a very common model. These are not private terminals.
Any follow-up, Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Sure. Oh, I see there are other questions. I'll defer to others. Thank you.
Ms. Zalatel, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd still like to have this discussion about a single tariff that is all users, not cargo users, not petroleum cement users, because what I'm feeling like we're running into is we have these diverging interests when really we have a holistic port. All these pieces work together. What we have, I mean, I guess I want to express this concern when we hear these two proposals is what we have are two competitors with two different ideas, and not an overall holistic view of how to sustain these port operations should either of these users move on and we have new users. So it's a concern, and I don't know if either of the presenters want to kind of address how either one of their proposals kind of get to that point, but this feels very user specific and not necessarily port as to the port holistically.
Yeah, this is Bal. I'll be happy to speak to that. So let me give you a current example. In Dutch Harbor, city of Unalaska, we use the city's terminal. O&E, an ocean carrier, Maersk, APL, and Matson serve that port. And for Matson, we are a terminal provide terminal services to Maersk and O&E. But O&E just decided to suspend their service. Why did they decide to suspend their service? They suspended their service to Dutch Harbor because the ships on the route were much bigger than the smaller ships they were operating. And they determined that they couldn't make the call in Dutch Harbor because it couldn't support their ship any longer. So they are now out of that service. So the idea is the port needs to decide what it needs to support what it wants for its market in Alaska. O&E is an example, right, which is a major Japanese carrier, is these carriers will come and go for different reasons. Right? Just as we've watched the evolution of carriers in Alaska, right? They change, they come and they go. The idea is the port needs to be able to support Alaska and Alaskans, regardless of whether Matson's coming or Tote's coming or somebody else. Hopefully that provides some clarity.
Can I ask a quick follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Please. Yes,
so
please.
So are you suggesting then that the port should decide what it needs for its sustainability and present that to the users, and the users could take it or leave it?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think that's what's going to happen, right? So we are providing our input, and we have worked closely with the port, and I do believe that as a result of that communication and working with the port and the challenge that we've made internally, the consultants that we've hired to address this and come up with how do we come up with what we need to support Alaska that's affordable. So we are looking at what are the number of cranes, what are the size of cranes, what is the berth level, do we need to go out 140 feet? What are the economics of going out 140 feet? And is the operating cost of going out 140 feet offsetting the construction cost and the maintenance cost savings for dredging? Those are all things that we need to look at, and we are with tremendous effort from a lot of people, which I think is all very positive. So I think the idea that this is to provide an incentive to make sure that we don't ask for more than we get. You shouldn't give us more than you determine after all these conversations we need, right? Or the port needs to operate. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. The next person in the queue is Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm hoping there's someone from the administration here, and I know we'll have other conversations with them, but just really quickly, if Mr. Falsey is here or someone else, you know, the way I see Bill now. So the way I understand part of Mr. Dreyfus's concern is that the current plan of finance would make the lift-on, lift-off terminal, and I always get the numbers confused, but the lift-on, lift-off terminal so expensive that it would end up in sort of a death spiral in terms of freight coming across it. And then ultimately the fees would be raised for the other terminal as well. And Mr. Dreyfus, you can correct me if I'm misstating my understanding of your position. But, you know, I guess I'd want to hear if that is one of their concerns. I'd want to hear Mr. Falsey address it directly.
That is our concern. I think the concept would cause significant economic disruption, and that economic disruption would be caused by Matson would be paying $506 more a container, more than the same container coming across the dock next door, regardless of whether it was rolled on the ship and driven off the ship, or whether it was lifted from a container crane on and off the ship. That's the issue. And I think that complicates things for the port from a financial perspective, because now any lender is going to say, wait a minute, it's easy to sit here and say, okay, there's X 100,000 containers that move across the docks today, and I can project how many containers based on a growth rate going forward, and I can predict my revenue stream and what's the likelihood of my getting paid back. That one's pretty straightforward and easy. If he now has to decide, oh, wait a minute, they're changing the way the cost structure is, so now there's going to be a shift of cargo away from the more expensive cost carrier to the lower cost carrier, the way it's structured, to now even outside forces like barge operators that operate that don't use the port of Alaska. Those are the things that I find would be economically disruptive and not in the best interest of Alaska or the port.
Briefly, I would like to have Mr. Hoffling also answer that question. Are you there, Alex?
I am, yeah. And so I would say to that, there's already significant cost variances between our operating models. You know, Bal mentions they use the containers, they have fees for that, for the cranes. We use a series of ramps and husters that we maintain, and there's costs associated with that. Our vessels were built in 2003. They're a more costly vessel to build and to operate. They come with the benefit of less port infrastructure in mind. So they're already, and across all businesses, there's cost variances in mind, and that's actually a good thing for the market. It produces a good thing for society, and it forces innovation to reduce cost to best serve the market, and it's healthy.
So I'm going to jump in here now and say that this topic, we're going to move forward on to the next one. And the intent of receiving these letters in writing from both users is to hand them off to Mr. Falsey, who has been the steward of drafting the plan of finance. Bill, here they are. I hand them to you. And my hope is that you will now take these considerations and begin an earnest negotiation between the parties on the details. Your thoughts?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I should say I am just the pretty face. Stand on the work of giants. But that's exactly right. We put out the draft plan of finance to get this conversation started in earnest. We've had internal conversations with Tote and Matson separately. They have been productive. We'll have more to say. I don't have an official position to give folks now, but I will say we were encouraged by Matson's letter that they think that significant costs can be eliminated, because to the extent that is true, that is in everybody's interest. We're hoping that conversation comes to a head in the next few weeks, because we are striving to drive towards a timeline that largely by the end of this year, we would know pretty much exactly what we are doing. So it's a productive conversation. We'll have more to say. We are chewing on these considerations.
Thank you very much. And now it is time to pivot to the conversation about the Port Advisory Group, whatever we're going to end up finally calling it. Mandy, can you pop that draft document up into the view? And I am wondering if Dean Gates is listening and here.
Hi, yes, I sure am, Mr. Chair. I'm listening and I'm here.
Thank you, Dean. I am hoping you will take us through your commentary that you shared with us and just kind of give us a very, as brief as possible, overview of what this document is right now.
Sure. Well, I'll try to meet those hopes. And let me just get started with a little background. So there's been some discussion about establishing this advisory committee comprised mostly of users of the port, Matson, Tote, and others. And I would speculate that that's an idea that's probably come up time again throughout history, but we got more serious about actually progressing to establish one a year ago. And so I think last January, the administration produced a draft and provided that to the committee and the users group. And we had some response from the users group in May that had really substantial changes and suggestions as to what the Port of Alaska users group wanted to see the structure of this advisory committee. And it was then landed in my lap. And, you know, with my role and my experience in drafting code and looking at Title IV boards and commissions provisions through the years, I tried to improve it a bit. But I actually backpedaled and produced this draft, which very closely tracks what the Port of Alaska users group provided, because they put a substantial amount of work into it. And so I very much respect that, and they did a great job. So I wanted to run through the document and make a comment on some concerns I had and what I might suggest to improve and things like that. So basically, the first part I would note is that the title of this ordinance, I made it flexible so that if we change where we're putting this in code or what it's called and things like that, that title's flexible enough for amendments and changes. And actually, it's not submitted yet, so we can change anything. But once we submit it for agenda, we would be limited by what this title says. Next, all these whereas paragraphs are basically pretty much exactly what the ordinance draft from the administration produced back in January. And, you know, it's excellent, so I didn't change that. And I didn't see comment from the users group to change it. So if we could get to the next page, Andy, please. So section 1 here. This is new, and I think with my contribution, nobody's probably seen this, but we have a port commission, and I structured this the same way. So we just mentioned this new advisory board in Title IV, which is our boards and commissions section of code. And we just mentioned it there. Here under the chapter 450 for technical advisory boards, which is basically what this advisory board or committee function as. And so section 1 is just a basic establish the structure here and where it goes in code. But I think that the section that lays out all the provisions, how this will work, is section 2. And put that in chapter 11. Section 1153 is the Port Commission section. So I would place this right off grid, Port of Alaska Modernization Program and Design Advisory Board. Now, I highlighted a bunch of language here, mostly to indicate what I changed or what I suggested be changed, or parts where we had a version 1 and 2 from the users group. They provided a majority wanted this and a minority also wanted something a little different. There's 3 places where we had a minority recommendation. So am I doing okay so far? Any questions? Should I continue?
Are there any questions? Seeing none, let's go on, Dean.
Yeah, all right. So the first thing I highlighted, advisory board here. It's been called an advisory committee in all the previous drafts, but if we're establishing this as an advisory board in code in Title IV, there's no committees there. They're either commissions or a board, and so I'm calling this an advisory board. And basically, our charter requires boards and commissions members to be appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the assembly. There's a few exceptions, but that wouldn't apply here. So if we're establishing it this way, to be advisory to the mayor and the assembly, I think it should be an advisory board, the membership appointed that way. So that's one major difference here from the draft we had. Now the next part, the subsection A is just establishing the board and what it's intended to do, and this follows the port advisory, the port users group language. It may be structured a little different. So the first highlight, the necessary project, the minority wanted to say necessary reconstruction project. The majority just said a necessary project for the Port of Alaska Modernization Program. And so I don't know if I need to run down what all this language says, but one is the purpose of this project, the HAMP, and A2 is saying, no, it's the interest of so many in Alaska that this PAMP is done well. In fact, we've discussed all along, so that's just straightforward common sense. And part 3 is actually the language this advisory board is established. And again, I highlighted the name. And I highlighted that because the users group had also said this advisory board to the mayor of Anchorage, but I took that out because it's also advisory to the mayor and assembly, and we'll see that language later. Second, the last word, moving the program forward, I highlighted program because the advisory group, the users group, said moving the project forward, but I think PAMP, I mean, the word is a program, and it's really a collection of numerous projects. So I didn't want to mix up the language too much there. I wanted to be very specific. So next we have a membership, and the membership here, the composition from the January draft had 9 members. The users group recommended this of 5 members, and I highlighted that language in subsection B that I've added, which is very similar to what's generally in boards and commissions establishment in Title 4. And it says how many members and appointed by the mayor, confirmed by the assembly. And usually the department that this advisory board is for provides staff, and so the port director provides designated staff support, you know, to record the meetings and do the minutes and the agenda and stuff like that. So the 5 membership is basically what the users group suggested, except number 2, I said a member selected by the mayor. The users group had suggested municipal manager, and I had concerns about number 1, the director and the municipal manager being on this advisory board. And almost all the other technical advisory boards, the department head that they advise is not on board. They're the person that this advisory board is providing advice to. And so you want a little more independence, I think, generally in advisory boards, so that the group can make a recommendation and give it to that department. So I would actually recommend a different composition for number 1 and 2. Instead of the director of the port and a member selected by the mayor is probably okay. I would not recommend this manager. So that's for your consideration. So let's see, 3, 4, and 5 are just fine. It is interesting though that a huge difference between the January draft and the admin was a little more generic in not naming a specific company or user of the port as having a designated member. But this probably works, I guess, if by some chance in the future there's some big change in a port user, Madison, you know, is taken over by some other company, even made the code and changed the name. So it's not as generic as the draft you saw in January. So anyway, subsection C here, it has meetings and procedures, and I had a number of concerns with the draft provided. Some of this is similar to the administration's January draft. So anyway, let's get to the differences here. Number 1 and 2 are just fine. It establishes some meeting frequency and some expectation that the port director will give reports. Number 3 is establishing what constitutes a quorum. And I used language that's more common in our code. Majority of the seats of the board constitutes a quorum. And you see, I actually need to refer back to my notes about what the user group suggested, but I can do that later. Next was number 4. I deleted the vote of a quorum for the simple majority to approve any motion from this advisory board. And basically, if a quorum is a majority of seats and you've got 5, that's going to be 3, and then you're saying to pass the motion, it's a majority of a quorum. If you have 3 people show up, you can do business, and then 2 vote to approve, you know, some design criteria to send. Basically, that would meet the requirements that were drafted. And that's actually a minority of the whole board of 5. So, you know, you want to avoid situations like that. So I say simple majority of the full board instead of a vote of a quorum. So that's just sort of like some technical change to how votes are counted here. Second, I have number 5, that was language from a users group that's not in the administration's draft. And I strongly recommend deleting that. So basically, allowing proxies to vote. I have concerns that that violates our charter, the appointment clause, where the mayor appoints and the assembly confirms a member of the board, and then that person can just designate someone else as a proxy. They could, according to this, they could do it to attend meetings and take their vote and do that for any number of meetings they wanted to. And this is something that's basically sort of unheard of in a government type board or commission. It's probably more common in corporate governance, and maybe that's what some in the users group are more accustomed to working in corporate governance environment, but it's basically unheard of in public government. I consulted with the Department of Law a little bit on this as well, and there was other concerns too. One is that, and we have, I think, Mr. Todd Sherwood, he had some good points and did some research. The Open Meetings Act, state statute, Open Meetings Act, wouldn't allow this either, because there's language that requires each vote of the person who's entitled to vote to be recorded at each meeting. So if you designate a proxy, that's not the person that's entitled to vote by the code. And they've basically given away their entitlement to vote, and that really deprives the public of the person who is appointed through a public process to cast that vote. So I basically recommend no proxy voting here, and actually there's no place in our Anchorage Municipal Code where voting by proxy is allowed, except for the recommended bylaws of community councils.
Dean, quick question: how much more do you have?
Do you have something to add? Oh, sorry. I'll try to speed this up a little.
And I have 2 questions, one from Mr. Weddleton and one from Mr. Dreyfus. So, John, if you want to queue up real quick. And I think you're muted. Okay, why don't you go ahead, Val, and then we'll come back to John.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And actually, as he went on, I got the answer to my question, so thank you.
All right, thanks. John, are you there?
Yeah, I think a broad question on this, and it may have already been asked, and I apologize for that. We are just focused on having this advisory board, it seems like, for the Port of Alaska Modernization Program, which will eventually happen and be done, but we'll still need a board like this. I mean, does it make sense to just create an advisory board and remove the reference to the Port Modernization Program?
About using the Port Modernization Program language, and that might be true. This is a very long-term program, I believe. I'm not sure we had a 10-year or longer date, but this advisory board, if you look at the end of the document, the last section, and it's something that we see in a lot of boards and commissions, not all of them, but this expires every 3 years. And we have a process for boards and commissions every 3 years when the expiration is coming up. Our internal auditor does a review and see how it's functioning and the attendance, and provides a report to the assembly. And then in October of the year, the boards that are expiring that year can be reauthorized or not. So this one will expire in October 2023 unless it's reauthorized by a code amendment. And you probably recall seeing an ordinance that amends a number of board and commissions expiration dates to reauthorize them.
All right, thank you. So I see maybe Steve or Buffalo, was your hand raised?
Yes, it was. And this is just a comment with respect to Mr. Weddleton's question, if I may. Considering the long-term requirement for this, I would suggest that maybe we consider that the Anchorage Port Commission serves that longer-term purpose. And this was specifically designed to assist with any dispute resolution kinds of issues that come up during the modernization program, and it should sunset when we cut the ribbon on all things considered and are done. Just for
Thank you.
consideration. Thank you.
Hey, Dean, I've got about 2 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So, let's see. So that's about proxy voting. And then I have some little comment there in brackets where I say the POG drafted procedure. They provided, I omitted a couple of things. One is public meetings. The Open Meetings Act and our code about public meetings applies to all boards and commissions. And stating it here is sort of redundant. And then agendas and recordings. You could have this language, it's not really required. You could go ahead and record and all of that. We do have general provisions in Title IV that applies to all boards and commissions that do require minutes to be taken and the vote recorded, and the audio recordings aren't there, but those are routinely done and they're very easy to do. And so the staff to this advisory board can be directed to do these things. So you can include that 3G agenda recording language, but it's not really necessary to do so. So I just suggested omitting it. Since we're putting in code, we should suggest keeping the language very specific and only codify what's needed. So next I have in D1, the functions and duties of the advisory board. One is recommendation of basis of design documents. And I highlighted this just because I saw the drafts design criteria, the term used, and basis of design documents also used. They seemed interchangeable. So maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not a technical person in terms of engineering and design criteria, but I want to be consistent with the terminology used here for this board's function. So we can change basis of design documents to recommended design criteria. I leave that for the group to decide and the assembly members. So next, the A, B, and C are basically what the users group provided. Most of this language is what the users group provided. One concern I had is in 1B, where submitting to the board for review any changes in the threshold that would trigger that. I thought the 5% or 2 million is actually maybe a little low for what's a $1 billion overall program, but that's just a thought I would toss out there. And so secondly, and number 2, I highlighted it to a not more than 60 days. So the minority report from the users group suggested not less than 60 days. And so the difference here will be this language that I included would be the administration's got 60 days to look at the recommendation and deliver it to the assembly, not 61, less than 60. The other way would be the administration gets 60 days. After that, they can send it to the assembly whenever. So I chose the majority's language to present here, but wanted to point out that difference. Let's see.
Dean, I'm going to say thank you to
I
that.
had mentioned the expiration date at the end of the document, and I just wanted to point out. Yeah.
Okay, quickly.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Constant.
Okay, you know what I'm going to suggest that we do now that we have the draft document not yet introduced is I am going to ask the council to prepare the document for introduction, and then we will ask the chair to schedule a work session on the topic so that we can get closer to the final documents and have opportunity for discussion of amendments. And that's the process going forward. And I'm sorry we're running out of time, that we need to pivot topics now. And Ms. LaFrance is prepared to do a discussion about the stormwater utility. Suzanne, I'm sorry that it's not going to be 15 minutes. It's going to be closer to 7 minutes, 8 minutes. And so with that, I'm going to turn over the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mr. Constant. And I believe we've got Mark Corsentino and Mark Schimsheimer on as well. And we did not have a whole lot of time at last Friday's work session for questions. So this time now to provide an opportunity for further questions. If we do proceed with the Stantec RFP with the revised scope, we would have a decision gate before proceeding with an application to the RCA for a CPCN, which is a big change from what we had originally discussed as a path forward. And so a couple questions I had were, one, to confirm that this Stantec RFP is not to exceed, that this amount will get us through to that decision gate. And then the second question being, how long would the information, the deliverable from Stantec, be current, so that if we get to that decision gate and decide we don't want to proceed with pursuing a CPCN at that time, it will be an additional amount, and perhaps one of the marks can speak to that. How long will that information be useful?
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. This is Mark Corsentino, and I'm here with Mark Shimsheimer. To answer the first question, it is a not to exceed amount, so it does not exceed that amount. And it is a gated process that will take us to whether or not we do want to go forward with the CPCN and a full-blown utility. The information that we generate in this report will be current for several years. That being said, when and if we decide to go through with the CPCN and a full utility, the financial information would have to be updated with the most current test year data, so you can establish tariffs and rates that are current with the most information and with the most recent financial information.
Okay, thank you. And would you guys be able to speak to the additional costs from that decision gate to the CPCN application?
Before you do that, please note for the record that Mr. Perez Verdia has joined us. Thank you.
There would be another phase 3 effort. There would be some additional costs. It would be a separate contract and venue. There would be some legal fees associated with that. And then honestly, really that will be determined in an estimate to go to the next phase 3, if you will be determined in this phase 2 effort, because we've got to establish a level of service in the formation of the utility.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Constant, if other members have questions now, this would be a good time.
All right, does anybody wish to ask questions regarding this stormwater utility update? I'm not seeing any questions. Do you have a recommendation, Mr. France?
I intend to put a resolution before the body that if we do move forward with this RFP, that the advisory commission needs to be in place. And I'm not ready to, and I know we don't debate here, but I don't have a position yet on whether or not we should move forward with this particular RFP with Stantec.
Okay, thank you. Again, Ms. Salatel, you're in the queue, please.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance, is what you're suggesting that you would want the advisory commission to weigh in on the Stantec contract if it's sufficient enough to cover whatever concerns may be? I just want to make sure I understand.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Through the chair, that would have been my preference, is that the advisory commission would have been stood up now. And I understand that a lot has happened since we had those discussions, and that hasn't been feasible. And I don't know if Mr. Bockenstead is on the line. We did have a discussion about that, and I believe it is the administration's position that standing up the commission before we commit to an RFP is not something that they support, and that if we don't approve the RFP, there's no point in having the commission. But I don't want to speak for the administration, and perhaps someone could address that.
Is anyone, Mr. Corsentino, anyone interested in addressing that?
If no one else speaks up, I'll be happy to.
This is Jason Bockenstead. Yes, I'm happy to address that. I think Assembly Member LaFrance got that mostly right. That the way that the commission, when the commission was approved by the Assembly, the role that they were to play was to provide comments and feedbacks on the report. It was not designed to provide comments on the RFP. So in our view, if the RFP is not approved, there is no work. So we would be appointing people to do nothing. As I said, I think Assemblymember LaFrance got it mostly right on our position.
All right, thank you. Mr. Gates is the final person in the queue on this topic. Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would just note that we have a code on this new Stormwater Utility Advisory Commission. It's in section 47070. And I think that I might have a little different perspective than Mr. Brackenstead. I think that its function to review and make recommendations here in 47070 would include looking at the RFP. I haven't seen the RFP, so I can't say that specifically, but I believe that they would be able to provide advice on the scope of this RFP, what its objectives are, and so forth. And the composition of this would probably have some input into what the RFP should say. So that's just an idea. But nothing in the code actually requires nothing in the code actually requires the commission to review an RFP before it goes out, but it's something that can be referred to them.
All right, thank you. I believe we'll be having a debate on this topic coming up at the next meeting, and we will proceed with where the dice fall on that there. And we'll, if we need to delay it, we may again, but I look forward to seeing where we go. Now we're going to shift to the final topic of the meeting. And this topic is a briefing from Merrill Field. Mr. Ralph Gibbs is going to walk us through appropriations from the CARES Act funds and intended plans that are developing for the use of those funds on the MRI campus. Mr. Gibbs, take over.
If you give me just a second to share my desktop, I'll pull up my PowerPoint. While I'm doing that, for those who were involved with our discussions last summer, you might recall that there was quite a bit of contention. As I move through these slides, I just want to brief everyone that my conversations with the MAC and even with those individuals who raised the greatest amount of, I was going to say noise, that's probably not right, the greatest amount of concern last summer are very much in favor of what I'm proposing to do with the CARES funds. Just to roll into some background, we got $17.89 million. The FAA wanted us to accept it as operational funds, giving us the ability to convert or request a conversion to development funds for building things later on. And so what follows are my slides to show you what I think our priorities should be, subject to your approval. Number one, you'll see is providing some financial relief to the airport customers. Number two, due to the financial situation the airport has found it in, a lot of our maintenance vehicles, snow removal equipment in particular, has needed to be replaced but hasn't, and so we're going to put that at the top of the list. My neighbors in Fairview have put a full court press on me to improve the appearance, the facades, if you will, of our buildings along Orca. So we have programmed some dollars for painting and gates, et cetera, to improve our relationship with Fairview. There is a house that was purchased on Orca. It's called the Sandoval property, and it has been empty for at least a year or two, and we're going to destroy that and replace it with grass so it's a more natural environment for the Fairview community, and also remove the attraction to the squatters. Across the street is the green zone from 15th, and we need to thin that out for fire safety, etc. And also Fairview's requested that we cut up those logs and deliver them to Fairview so that they can use them in their community gardens. So in the context of see a need, fill a need, on Orca Street, there's kind of an eyesore, again, to the Fairview community, and we want to acquire the city electric properties for development. We've been approached by Launch Alaska. They would like to have a space on the airport to bring in some high-tech companies. Near and dear to my heart, one of them is an aircraft manufacturer building electric airplanes. There's a parking lot that's associated with those two buildings that I want to clear and make room for a new MOA simulator center. I want to fund some engineering for a precision approach. Many of our operators end up going over to Ted Stevens when the weather is too low. There's the Sim Center. Expand parking for the Orca businesses. For those of you who are familiar with the Medallion Foundation, they lost FAA support, and so they gave away their simulators, or the FAA took them back. They were brought here to help mitigate the controlled flight into terrain accidents in Alaska, which are higher here than they are in the low. So I was asked to make an application for those simulators. Some of them came here, but by bringing them here, then they will now be available to all the flight schools on the airport. Lake Hood, anyone in Alaska can access these simulators. They will also be available for the University of Alaska aviation program.
Hey, Ralph, I'm going to briefly interrupt and let you know we have 2 minutes left.
Okay. Well, let me run right to the dollar. I don't think anyone will disagree with some of the ideas. I just wanted you to know that everybody's on board. Let me go back. So the key takeaways here on this slide for the 4 years is we will continue to get AIP grants. They'll be funded at 93.75%, but we can use CARES funds to make the match, so there will be no cost to the users. We have these care development funds. You can see there we're going to have to request a conversion of at least 8 million so we can build the things that we want to build with that pot of money. So right now you'll see that of the 18, we've only got 16 committed, which leaves us 2 million uncommitted for us to figure out what we want to do when we grow up, so to speak. Hope that wasn't too fast. And that concludes my remarks.
Yep, Ms. Alta has a question.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to put a finer point on this. You have development funds under CARES. We have different pots of CARES money. Is there any CARES money you're asking us to appropriate to Merrill Field that isn't already dedicated to aviation?
Through the chair, no ma'am.
Thank you.
I know that Mr. Dunbar had some questions about this. Forrest, I know this is unsolicited from you, but do you have any input you want to have right now before we adjourn?
No, just to say, I mean, this is quite a lot of money, and we've just had a 6-minute presentation. I'm wondering if there's some way that we can engage a little more deeply the assembly to Merrill Field. I want us to be creative with this, and I see some really interesting creative ideas there that and certainly I appreciate that you are working with the Fairview Community Council and working there. But we are trying to use our funds in ways that promote equity and that sort of help to resolve some of the other challenges of the city as a whole. And so I just want to have a more in-depth conversation. I'm wondering if there's a forum that we could have that.
And if I might, Mr. Chair Felix, I know we have set aside a lot of time on Friday to address CARES Act conversations. I don't know if this is something we could portion of 20 minutes of that day, or if not, then maybe we do set up either a work session or just another committee meeting to have that conversation.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I will see if we can wrap this into the conversation tomorrow, but if not, I will take your other suggestion to do a work session just on this topic.
Thank you. And Mr. Gibbs, I just want to say thank you to you for addressing the concerns of the community very broadly in this conversation. I know it's always a hot topic when you show up. And so you have transformed the relationship between the airport and the community since you came on board. So thank you very much. And with that, if there's no other comments, we have some other items, but they're just standing items and we're out of time. Any objection to adjourning? No objection. Thank you, everybody. And we'll be going over to our budget committee next. Thank you.
Thank you.